All right, so we are a handful of podcasts in. I've lost track of exactly where we are, but I still think back to your very first words as we opened the podcast, our very first one. You remember what they were?
You mean the first two words?
Yeah, the first two words. You remember what you said?
I do.
Yeah, what'd you say?
If we're talking about the same first two words, it hurts.
Yeah, it hurts, right? That was the day that we talked a little bit about what happened when the radio show ended, and all of a sudden we found ourselves going, all right, well, now what? And so when you have a hurt, what do? You go see a doctor, right? You go see someone who can help. You go see a specialist. You go see somebody who can help properly diagnose what's going on and think, okay, what can we do to make things a little bit better? And so there is nobody better that we could bring in to the podcast right now than our friend, Phil Herndon. Our friend, but also introduce us to this guy.
Oh, please let me introduce you to Mr. Phil Herndon, 10mainministries.org. Phil, you have been my counselor since, I think, about February of 2021.
Sounds right.
And I thank you for that.
You are welcome, sir.
The world thanks you. My world, my family, my friends. Yes, very grateful. We went back to that time because I had lost my daddy to suicide. And that's where you entered into my story. That was loss. It was a big loss. And lately we've been watching a lot of loss.
Have we ever?
Wow. Just, and it's that time of the year because my daddy took his own life in November. So this time of the year always kind of brings up a lot of things. And yet, because of a lot of prayer and a lot of skills that you've taught me about how to go to the Lord with these things and how God's created the mind, I have learned to navigate it differently than I knew before. If someone is dealing with loss, and sometimes it's something simple, but it's aggravating. I lost my sunglasses. I know that's trivial in the scheme of what's going on right now in our world, but sometimes that's the straw that breaks the camel's back because you have the greater loss. We have flooding and we have loss of life and we have surprises and we have things that we're watching overseas. What is it initially when we have a loss that we're dealing with?
Yeah, it's important. First of all, thank you for the intro. So glad to be here with both of you.
Need a drum.
Yeah, right?
No drums, please. No, I'm so glad to be here with y'all. Speaking of loss, we're here doing this here because of loss.
Yep.
Right.
But your question, Dawn, it's really, if you go back to thinking about loss, if you just think about a map, maps have landmarks, maps have places where we orient ourselves. We've all been to I guess malls are kind of old now, but at the mall or an amusement park, the little "You Are Here" sticker, so I can orient my life from where I am now. Loss is really the same kind of way. Loss is a very disorienting experience. Walter Brueggemann does beautiful work on the Psalms. He calls it orientation, disorientation, and reorientation. Well, we map our lives with nouns. If you think people, places, and things, they're what map our lives. And so when we're living our lives, we come to rely on these people, places, and things to not move, to be the way they were yesterday. The brain is predictive. And so I wake up in the morning, I want to be in the house I went to sleep in and all those things. I want the people that are in their rightful places. And when a loss occurs, one of those nouns has moved, it's shifted. And so I'm disoriented. It's a disorienting experience because what I have counted on, not even realizing I was counting on it, to be there where it always has been and acting the way it always acted, it's no longer there, and it's extremely disorienting and scary.
Wow. So when we realize that something is gone and we begin to identify what that thing is, and sometimes it's real easy. Sometimes it's a job, it's a person, it's one of those really major things in our lives. Phil, it's one thing for me to say, I've lost my job, I've lost my spouse, I've lost a friend or a family member, kind of thing, and I'm disoriented by that. But in the middle of that, I don't know which way's up. What do you begin to do to begin to kind of make some sense of that?
Yeah, I'll steal from Dan Siegel. He says, we feel it to heal it, we name it to tame it. And so often, when it's something that seems kind of intangible, like the loss of a dream, the loss of a hope, I had a vision for the way something was going to happen, and I lost that. It's really necessary to sit down with someone that cares about you and says, all right, let's talk through what you lost when you lost it. One of my memories is both painful and kind of beautiful. I'm very close to one of my cousins, and I was talking to him shortly after my mother died, and I told him, his name is Richard. I said, Richard, it's so weird. It's like the world is scary. I'm a 46-year-old man. Like the world's scary all of a sudden. He said to me, he said, you have to remember that when Aunt Mary, my mom, when Aunt Mary died, when your mom died, you lost one of the most important prayer warriors you ever had, and your life is scarier. So just me naming, hey, the feeling is fear, loss, yes, sadness, yes, but I'm afraid. It's strange. When I named what really was happening with me, with whom I had lost, he was able to come along and say, he loves me. He's literally known me. We've known each other all our lives. He's 6 months older than me. So of all people, he was able to say, well, now that you've named it and you're feeling it, let me tell you what comes up in me knowing the situation like this. It's so important to, when I don't know something, name what I do know and feel what I feel. And when someone loves me and sitting across from me or with me, they can help me more specifically define what it is.
What about, though, like you're naming that person? We'll just take a person, and you're naming that person, but that person brought a lot of grief in your life, a lot of trauma. We talk about that in our broken relationships. It's hard because you think, well, you shouldn't miss the bad, the trauma, you should, and yet you still do. What's up with that?
It's so pesky, it's so irritating,
Yes.
But we are made for connection. And in your case, Dawn, in particular, like, daughters love their dads, and they can be so repulsed to love and reject love, but there's something inside of our DNA, literally DNA, that says, I am made for connection. Before humankind even existed, God was in a relationship of connection, 3 persons, one God, in the bond of love. And so the first thing is we desire connection deeply. We desire to connect to someone, to something. And then secondly, we often grieve because I desired, past tense, I desired connection. I'm really in touch with how little connection we had. And so that grief becomes, I'm grieving what we didn't have that now I know for sure we never will.
And so when we name what the loss is and we begin to think, all right, because I have lost that relationship and I'm never going to have that kind of thing, that could lead us to despair. That could lead me to throw a big old pity party. Just could lead me to, well, I'm never going to be able to have that relationship look the way that I thought it was going to look and wanted it to look. I would think acceptance has got to become a part of that, but you also probably don't want to rush that too quickly. So how do I know when I'm beginning to be ready to own the fact that this is my new normal?
Yeah. I love that phrase. I'm not much for faddish phrases, but new normal, like I think that's so illustrative. And Steve, you're nailing what acceptance really means. Like new means I haven't done this before. And normal is another way of saying it is I'm now daily integrating this new thing into my life. I was disoriented. And so I'm reorienting to kind of a new reality, how life is going to be from now on, who's not going to be here. And so part of that is, we've talked about it before in a previous life. We've talked about the importance of the word and.
Yeah.
And so we know we're integrating if we imagine that, what I didn't have or did have with this person and now I don't. When those are really far apart, we go, okay, I'm a good ways. It's going to be more naming and more defining and more processing feelings with people. And this idea of acceptance can be thought of to mean it's not okay and it's okay all at the same time. And the closer these two hands come together to say, okay, both of these are true. And there is an adage out there that says time heals all wounds. Well, time and dealing with sadness really does heal wounds. As time goes on, new things happen in life, new orientations, new people, new experiences. And so there is something to that old adage. Time and time alone doesn't do it, But as that and comes more real and the normal becomes integrated, it's like moving to a new city. I don't know where I'm going. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know anybody here. But after a while, when I stay after it, I keep getting out in town. I keep meeting people. I join a church. My kids are in a different school and that kind of thing. After a while, that becomes like, oh, and these things are both true.
Integration, though, sounds like it's going to take the work of the person that's grieving because of the loss and getting out there to meet the friends or trying for the new church. And if you're still in the disoriented stage and you're trying to get closer to both of these things can coexist. When you come up against that grief again, maybe the divorce was 25 years ago.
Yeah.
And yet the anniversary comes along and you realize had things been different, you'd have 35 years in. When you come up against that, is it just you lament, you be sad, you name it, you pray over it? What is one of the best ways that we can get through that time without kind of getting stuck?
Well, you mentioned earlier, Dawn, you're literally kind of in that zone right now. It's a couple of weeks, till the anniversary comes around again. And speaking of pesky, that part of the brain we've talked about before, that where the story kind of lives, it lives everywhere, but primarily in that right hemisphere of the brain where the limbic system it's called. It doesn't do chronology. I was going to say it doesn't do it well. It actually doesn't do it at all. So when we mark time again with anniversaries, that's how the brain works. We're predictive. Like every November, you will always know this is coming. And so the brain goes, oh, I know what to do because I know this story. This story is living up here. And so when the first part of November gets here, that's when I got to really be on guard to protect Dawn, in this case, from all of this pain. And so we begin to anticipate that loss that's coming. So when we're spending energy, literal brain energy, Lisa Feldman calls that brain allocation. When we're allocating resources to our brains in that way, it is a draining experience. And so part of that is being able to live with how normal it is, like anniversaries, birthdays, death dates, those kinds of things. I've worked with people who have moved to a new part of the country, and where they moved from, some holiday or some local tradition was a big deal on, February, whatever, and they miss it because this community doesn't celebrate that at all. And so any anniversary, the part of the brain that does relationship and feelings, it remembers, and it's going to make sure it's reminding you when that happens. So because that's what the brain does, like I'm going to protect first. And so to make that just a normal part of grief, it's been so many years, that part of your brain goes, I don't have any idea what you're talking about. I don't even know what a year is. All I know is November's coming. And those first 2 or 3 days of November are really, really scary, and I'm going to make sure I'm reminding her so she can be on guard, just to make that normal.
And so when the brain begins to do that, and it's like, hey, I'm going to let you know this thing is coming, I would think that there would be a part of me that would want to say, okay, I know the brain's going to do that, and I ought to be able to fight back in some way. I ought to be able to tell that brain that we can let that go. Right now, that doesn't need to have the power that it once did.
Stop doing
right? Stop. Right. You're laughing.
Yeah.
Why are you laughing?
Well, because it's funny.
Why is that?
You're laughing, so it's funny.
What is so funny? Enlighten me, Phil.
Make it stop.
No, so here's the other pesky thing. Word of the day, pesky. The feeling of sadness is highly associated with attachment. Right, it's like the level to which I'm willing to grieve a loss is going to have a lot to do with how deeply I'm willing to attach. Ecclesiastes says in chapter 3 that God has put eternity in the heart of humankind, and so here's what we know. Part of that humanness is we know we're made for eternity. Everyone lives somewhere for eternity, so we know that every relationship on earth ends painfully. They all end painfully. Divorce, estrangement, drifting, don't want to be your friend, moving away, ultimately death. And so we carry that in our being. Like I know that every person I care about, I'm going to leave them, they're going to leave me in some way, shape, or form. And I know that. And so if I know that and I attach deeply anyway, then I'm going to be reminded of how deep the attachment was. Even if the attachment was not on the surface close, in your case, Dawn, it's a father-daughter attachment, and that hole that says, I wish we could have because he's my daddy.
Mm-hmm.
That hole is big. And so it's not that, oh, we were just close. It has more to do with what the relationship could have been in the area of attachment and how desperately you wanted it. So we can remind our brains, but we're going to be fighting an uphill battle because the brain's like, oh, no, I'm made for attachment, and I'm made because I've got the image of God in me. So you can do all you want to do around this, and the best you're ever going to do is numbing that down. You're never going to lose the desire for attachment.
So when things happen like hurricanes or fires, and we lose things that we know we're not supposed to be attached to, but we are.
Yeah.
I mean, we get used to what we know. Whether it's a lot or a little, it doesn't really matter because we know that. And when it's gone, the grief process starts. Is there a point where we should be alarmed that the loss is still taking hold of our lives and it's more prevalent than the peace? Like they're not those hands aren't getting closer together yet. We're not living in the and. We're still living in the loss more than the peace.
Yeah, and that's a multivariate question that has so much to do with where a person is in life. Here, I'm going to give you a crazy sounding example. Several years ago now, my brother called me from Georgia, where we grew up, and he said, "Hey, I'm sitting right outside the backyard of our old house. There's some little bitty pine saplings. You want me to grab one for you? Just dig it up and put it in." He put that thing in a little Dixie cup that big. He brought it back to Murfreesboro, back to here. I planted that thing, and it is now gigantic. It's huge. And I planted it. I drove a miracle spike in the ground. I watered it, and I literally prayed, God, take care of your tree because I'm not going to obsess over this. So sure enough, that thing's probably, 20 feet tall. And one of our storms about 2 years ago struck it. Lightning struck it. And about a quarter of it just fell over into the yard. And I was burning. I cut it up and I was burning. And I got teary. And I walked back to the part of the tree that was remaining and said, God, please don't let the rest of this tree die. It's still alive. But that sounds kind of silly. But every time I'm pruning trees or at that fire pit, it's not dramatic by any means. But I'm reminded of how much that tree in my old backyard 50 years ago means to me. And so some of that has to do with what time of year is it. Some of that has to do with literally with what has been going on in my life that's reminded me of this person, place, or thing that I may not even be thinking about. My mother was a very talented artist and very difficult to live with. She had a mental disorder and made some crazy stuff. But anytime I see someone sketching something, I'll have a little pang of missing her, though we weren't really close. And so a lot of it depends on how aware am I of what's been loaded up in my brain that I don't maybe not even know about leading up to this.
So when the pang hits, whether it's the tree, the sketching, the thought of this is the anniversary of, I feel like I hear you say, go ahead and almost, in a sense, lean into it.
Yes.
Let it just kind of flow through you. Don't fight it. Recognize
it. Sometimes I fight it.
Okay. I mean,
but I think the recognition piece and allowing in my humanness to say, I don't like it. I'm going to fight it. And ultimately, hey, if I fight it and it recedes, great. Probably not going to. So if I fight it and it continues, maybe the best thing to do is to not give in to it, but give in to the reality that I am a connecting being and there's something going on. I'm really aware of the pain of this loss. And talking to other people and knowing that grief does come in waves and knowing that the lament psalms are there, and you see that in the life of the psalmist all the way through, and sometimes it feels unbearable. How long, O Lord, how long will this last? And then, but yes, the lean into it phrase that we use nowadays is super important. And leaning into it can sometimes mean I'm just going to go sit on my deck or wherever, and I'm just going to have my thoughts and feelings and memories of this, and then see what God does with it.
It's pretty fascinating too, because as I've leaned into it, or whatever language you want to, when those feelings come on, I've realized they will pass.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of been a surprise to me. I don't really know why that's a surprise to me. Probably because most of my life I felt like if the drama came, you had to hang on to it.
Yeah.
And if you didn't hang on to it, then you weren't dealing with it.
Yes.
But to just let the feelings kind of wash over you, through you in those moments. And for the most part, they'll move on. Most of the time.
Bless you.
What do you do on a podcast when you got to sneeze?
Yeah.
You just sneeze?
You just sneeze.
Just sneeze.
Do what you did. I hardly noticed at all.
Pardon me. So that to recognize that they'll go away.
Mm-hmm.
And that's okay too if I don't let them come on. Like this.
Let it go.
Like this.
Let it go.
Let it rip.
No,
Let it roll.
No, I
Yeah.
can't sneeze that big.
Through you. Come on, let's go.
Yeah.
Lean into it.
Really get, see? Nice work, Steve.
Thank you. I'm paying attention.
Oh yeah, you're just trying to be the teacher's pet.
Maybe.
maybe. When but if I don't, and I let those feelings that they don't move on through, or I ignore them
Mhm.
and tell them to go away,
Mm-hmm.
and I start pushing them down, just like I'm trying to do this sneeze again. I start pushing them down. That's not a good thing either.
Mm.
That's going to cause me another problem. What's
Yes.
that going to bring on?
That's going to bring on rumination. It will bring on obsession because it's kind of like, hey, do not dare think of ice cream. Don't do it. Don't. And then
Or the Stay
automatically
Puft
like,
Marshmallow
oh,
Man.
no. Right.
Uh-huh.
And so we can
Yeah.
describe it in detail. It works that way because the brain and the heart and how God has wired us for attachment is going to say, sorry. That's like standing in front of a tsunami going, hey, no, don't you dare come up here. It's going to happen. And there's a shortcut around this, I guess you call it a shortcut. We have to remember, too, that when we are, and Dawn, you're again in the throes of this, it's very rare that sadness is just sadness alone. There's almost always anger, hurt, loneliness. So a lot of times if we just concentrate on, okay, I'm going to feel this one feeling, and we're ignoring how lonely we are or how angry we are or how hurt we are. And this sounds crazy to say, but in some cases, even how glad I am, if there's, it doesn't even have to be a person. Like if somewhere I lived, or sometimes it's a beloved pet that was suffering, I'm glad he, she, it is no longer suffering. And so sometimes we will work so hard, okay, I'm just going to stay in the sadness. We're ignoring all kinds of other feelings knocking on the door saying, hey, me too. Pay attention to me too.
So when we do feel loss, some of those initial feelings I heard you say, sadness, anger, even gladness. What are some of the other? Are there other things that tend to come out during that time?
If we're doing what you were talking about, Don, if we're trying to sit on that sadness, it will come out as isolation,
Okay.
self-pity, ruminating back to, I'm not going to think about ice cream. I'm not going to think about this. I'm just not going to do it. And then, we can't help but do it. That's what rumination is. Rumination actually, brain-wise, get too deep in the weeds here, but brain-wise, what rumination does is the part of the brain that does retrieval. As we're retrieving it, it prolongs the activation of this part of the brain called the amygdala that creates fear, or that lets us know of fear. So what we end up doing, if we're trying to mash something down, we'll end up ruminating on it by trying not to ruminate on it.
Yep.
And it kicks up. It's like having your foot on the brake and on the gas at the same exact time. It just spins and spins and spins, which is where rumination comes from.
That sounds like something, though, that probably every person can think about and relate to, because we're thinking, we're not going to have dessert today. We're not going to have dessert today. We're not going to eat past 3 o'clock. We're not going to eat past 5 o'clock. And because you start, or if you're going to eat healthy, I'm only eating healthy today.
Yeah.
I'm not going to do anything, I think of some of the things my kids still eat, and I'm like, stop doing that. But if you tell them to stop doing that, that's going to be more powerful than just making the action to do it. So what do we do with rumination so that we can put it in its proper place?
The thing that almost always creates a rumination is fighting hard to not do it. Right. It's like, it's that same thing that don't think of the so-and-so. So ruminate, it seems very counterintuitive. But one of the best things we can do with rumination is just go ahead and write out. Remember the old, literal old school, write on the board 100 times, I will not talk in class. Literally have done that more than once. But, you maybe others, this go ahead and go with that resistance because the brain is begging you to think about this. Mm-hmm. And so it's like, okay, I'm going to go ahead and just let that thing play out and let it play out again and let it play out again because there's a myth that says, okay, if I resist this enough times, it'll stop. And it may stop in its current form. It will show up in another. GI distress, headache, tension, body aches, joint aches. It's going to show up. And so if I can just do what seems so strange, if I can just take it, write it out, speak it out, run the tape forward, it does eventually, like a wave of grief, it does eventually play out.
So back to your ice cream thing, rather than saying, I will not think about ice cream, I will not think about ice cream, I can think about, oh, this is the ice cream that I want, and it would be really good right now. But for a specific reason, I can't have it at this point in time.
Yes.
But go ahead, lean in, name it, feel it in a sense, and let it kind of flow through you.
Yes.
Okay.
And that's a terrible, terrible prescription. And it's literally the only thing that works.
Yeah.
Now, it'll work. We can, ignore it or distract ourselves or doom scroll or drink or whatever to anesthetize it. But that's different than letting it work through. Both of them stop the symptom. One of them stops the symptom like cutting off a weed at the surface. The other one addresses the symptom at the root.
Mm. So I think of, what happened a handful of weeks ago and why this podcast now exists, loss of a job. And in the initial days, you kind of, at least I was replaying that scene over and over and over again.
For sure.
It came to a point of saying, yep, that happened. And there's, of course, the little element of fear that sometimes comes with that because, now income is going to go away. And until income is replaced, how are the kids going to eat and how are all the things that go along with that. But it was, I think, sitting and almost talking it out over and over and over again, where a lot of the power of it seemed to leave. So when it comes back, it doesn't come back as frequently. And it doesn't come back as powerfully as it does anymore. But there does come a point where I think a lot of us say, okay, I don't know what the new normal looks like, but I know there needs to be one.
Yeah.
So as I began to come out maybe of the little bit of that loss, is there a point where you, in a sense, begin to dream again, where you begin to say, all right, that's gone, I need to move on in a certain direction?
Yes, and that there's a two-edged sword to that question, Steve. One is some people will want to rush to the new, oh, I don't care what it takes, just survival, or have all this false guilt or shame around that. Like very often when a spouse dies, someone it feels like betrayal, and it may be years or who knows. There's no magic line where that becomes okay, but a very common phrase is, well, it feels like I'm betraying so and so, or gosh, it feels like I'm, that kind of thing. And so part of that also is seeking wise counsel. It can be a trusted friend, pastor, a therapist, someone that really cares about you to say, hey, put eyes on this. It's an old AA term. You need eyes on you, man. And so, hey, put eyes on this for me. Like it's been so-and-so, and have someone really help you unpack that story to say, okay, well, let's talk about your grief journey and what still hurts, and to go through that 8 core feelings list or your feelings wheel or whatever you use. Let's just start identifying on here what's hanging on to you, and let's talk that through. And, there's a old saying, I don't know where it even came from. One says we need to calculate, what am I gaining by hanging on to this? And what will it cost me to let it go? And sometimes walking into a new thing is really scary. But if I've got people walking with me, they can help me discern. Healthy fear brings discernment. And in the presence of many counselors is wisdom. And so if people that really care about me are putting eyes on me to say, okay, let me take this step with you, whatever that new step may be. That's super helpful for that.
Wow. Good stuff.
Yep.
Good stuff. Loss. It's so prevalent for each one of us. Every single person has experienced a loss, and it might have been something that was trivial, but it could be something more likely that was really, really difficult. And dealing with loss is possible. And the Lord is always near to the brokenhearted. And we're reminded of that every single day. And we're grateful for Phil Herndon with 10 Man Ministries walking us through some of these things that we can do to walk through the journey of loss, because that's never going to change. Thank you so much for joining us. It's Dawn and Steve plus Phil Herndon and plus you. If you haven't liked and subscribed yet, would you be our plus one?